The air in the sterile high-rise condo was always cold, but tonight, it felt like deep space. Clara stood by the wide glass window, overlooking the endless, glittering grid of the city. To a casual observer, she was simply a woman gazing at her kingdom. But Clara knew the truth. The kingdom was a facade and the woman was a ghost. Her hands rested lightly on the cool glass. They didn't tremble. Not anymore. Trembling was a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness she had meticulously purged from her system over the last 8 months. It had started the night Victor, her husband, her rock, her betrayer, came home with a sickeningly casual confession. "It's all gone, Clara," he'd said, leaning against the marble kitchen island, his tie loosened, a sheen of sweat on his forehead that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with a kind of cowardice that made her stomach turn. "The accounts. The funds. The house is leveraged. The business, it's bankrupt." He had gambled everything. Their life savings. Her inheritance. The foundation of the life she'd spent 10 years building. Victor, the man who had promised security, had delivered ruin. But it wasn't the financial devastation that had solidified the ice in her heart. It was the look in his eyes when he told her. It wasn't regret. It was entitlement. He saw himself as a victim of circumstance, not the architect of their destruction. The subsequent months had been a living hell. The debt collectors calling at all hours. The silent, judging glares of their friends. The painful, public spectacle of losing their assets piece by agonizing piece. Clara had watched her identity, the capable, composed, successful woman, crumble into dust. Victor, meanwhile, had simply retreated. He took the last remaining funds to rent this temporary, soulless condo and started spending his days in a cycle of self-pity, alcohol, and hollow promises of a comeback. Clara, however, never cried. She never yelled. She simply listened. She listened to his drunken rants. She listened to his condescending apologies. She listened to the hollow echo of her own dreams disintegrating. And in that silence, something new began to grow, something cold, focused, and utterly perfect in its singularity: vengeance. Revenge for Victor would not be a crime of passion. It would not be a moment of red-hot fury that could be explained away by temporary insanity or sudden provocation. Victor deserved something far more fitting, a calculated, perfect demise that mirrored the precise, controlled way he had orchestrated her ruin. "He took everything I valued with cold, precise calculation," she thought, her breath barely fogging the glass. "Therefore I will take what he values most, his life, with even greater precision." Her preparation began quietly, methodically. She found a part-time job under an assumed name, securing a tiny, separate income stream, her war chest. She researched for weeks, not on how to commit a crime but how to not commit one. She studied toxicology reports, focusing on compounds that mimicked natural health crises. She read police procedure manuals, concentrating on the protocols for death investigations. The true crime podcast that she used to listen to for entertainment became her schooling. She learned about alibis. A perfect alibi wasn't just being somewhere else, it was being somewhere else in the context of your routine. It had to be a natural extension of her current, mundane existence. She started taking long, solitary walks to a small hidden park miles from the condo. A new, strange habit she developed slowly, making it seem like a coping mechanism for her stress. This was her life now, the quiet student of death, the meticulous architect of Victor's final hour. The waiting wasn't an act of patience, it was an act of engineering. She was simply waiting for the variables to align, for the opportunity to present itself with the geometric certainty of a mathematical proof. She turned away from the window, the city lights reflecting for a moment in the vacant stillness of her eyes. Victor was asleep in the master bedroom, oblivious, cushioned by his usual evening cocktail. He wouldn't even notice the microscopic changes to his environment, the subtle shifts in the rhythm of his life, until it was far, far too late. The clock on the wall read 2:14 a.m. The time for waiting was almost over. Clara's research had led her down a path that was not glamorous, but terrifyingly effective. Digital forensics. The easiest way to get caught, she learned from the countless case files she devoured, was through an electronic trail. A search history. A dropped GPS pin. An email. So for 3 months she operated entirely offline, away from the condo's network. She frequented a public library 3 towns over, using a newly created guest account on a loaner laptop. Her searches were innocuous, layered under searches for real estate investment blogs and resume workshops. But buried within those sessions was the true data, the molecular structure of potassium chloride, the speed of its absorption into the bloodstream, and the typical symptoms of a sudden, fatal myocardial infarction. Potassium chloride. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Overdose could stop a heart instantly, mimicking a natural cardiac event, especially in a man with Victor's stress levels and drinking habits. It was readily available, disguised in certain dietary supplements she had ordered weeks ago, mailed to a vacant P.O. box she would discard after the act. It was virtually untraceable by standard toxicology screenings unless investigators were specifically looking for it, a search that was only prompted by suspicion of foul play. Suspicion was the enemy. Certainty was the goal. The key to preventing suspicion was motive control. The police would search for two things: someone who benefited and someone who hated him. Benefit was easy. She would gain freedom, not wealth. The estate was ruined anyway. But hate? She couldn't display hate. She had to display grief. Clara began her performance weeks ago. She started documenting her concerns about Victor's health. She would casually mention to the building's concierge, to her few remaining acquaintances, and even to Victor himself, how worried she was about his stress-related palpitations and the unhealthy flush in his cheeks. She would leave printouts of articles about silent heart attacks on the kitchen counter, ensuring Victor saw them and, more importantly, dismissed them. On the third day of the month, the variables finally aligned. Victor was throwing a small, pathetic gathering of his last remaining business associates, a transparent attempt to drum up new capital. He would drink heavily as always. He would be loud as always. And critically, his routine would be set: a nightcap of expensive scotch and a dose of his prescribed routine antacid. The night arrived with the dull, oppressive humidity of a late summer evening. Clara put on a simple black dress, the kind a supportive, weary wife wears. She smiled a small, tired smile for the two guests who bothered to show up. She played the part of the silent sufferer to perfection. Victor was already drunk by 9 p.m. He was loud, boastful, and dismissive of Clara, openly blaming her lack of understanding for the business's failure. It was exactly what she needed. The humiliation felt fresh, yet she barely registered it. The pain had been replaced by focus. At 10:45 p.m., the guests departed, shaking Clara's hand with pitying eyes. "Just get the hell out of my sight, Clara," Victor slurred, already heading toward the liquor cabinet. "And bring me that damn white powder for my stomach." He was referring to his antacid, a common white powder mixed with water. The potassium chloride, which she had carefully pulverized into an identical texture days ago, sat ready in a separate, tiny glass vial, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her closet. Clara moved with the mechanical grace of a clockwork doll. She went to the kitchen. Victor was pouring himself a generous measure of single malt scotch. She filled a glass with water and placed the genuine antacid on the counter, then quickly returned to her closet. The exchange was swift and silent. The vial of fine, white powder was secured in the palm of her hand. Back in the kitchen, Victor hadn't moved. The light from the refrigerator cast a harsh, blue-white glow on his face, illuminating every fold of slack skin and every capillary burst on his nose. He looked, finally, like the ruined man he was. "Here," she said, her voice soft, devoid of any warmth or malice. Just neutral. Victor barely glanced at her. He took the antacid glass from her hand. "Don't hover," he muttered, waving her away. "Go take your damn walk, I don't need your pity." Clara gave a small, weary sigh, the final touch of her performance. "I'm just worried about you, Victor. Your heart." She watched, her own heart a dead weight in her chest as he tapped the white powder, the poison, from the vial into the water. The substance dissolved instantly, without trace, without a bubble. He stirred it with his finger, raised the glass, and swallowed the entire concoction in one gulp, followed by a large, bracing swallow of scotch. He shuddered once, a genuine physical reaction to the bitter taste, but his attention was already back on his drink. "Now go," he repeated, his voice thick. "I will," Clara said. She didn't wait. She turned and walked toward the door. This was the moment of alibi creation. The walk was essential. It wasn't just a physical journey, it was the final layer of psychological protection. If she was out of the condo the moment he died, the timeline would be broken, her presence irrelevant. Clara walked. She moved with a quick, deliberate pace, ignoring the sudden, heavy thrum of adrenaline that finally hit her. It felt like a current, shocking her awake after months of emotional numbness. She checked her phone. It was 11:05 p.m. The park was 4.2 miles away. A fast walk, especially in her driven state, would take her a little over an hour. Too long. The fatal dose she gave Victor would act within minutes, not hours. Her alibi couldn't be a destination, it had to be a traceable path. She stopped at a corner store she'd scouted weeks prior. It was a well-known 24-hour establishment with multiple surveillance cameras. She walked inside, grabbed a bottle of water, and approached the counter. The clerk, a tired young man she didn't recognize, barely looked up. "Just this," she said, her voice steady, pulling out the exact change she had set aside. The young man scanned the item. 11:15 p.m. The camera above the register caught her face clearly, her black dress, her tired, grief-stricken expression. She paid, accepted the receipt, and put it directly into her pocket. A physical, time-stamped, third-party verified record. She had placed herself 1.8 miles from the murder scene at 11:15 p.m. She walked out and continued her journey to the park, but she made a second stop. A well-lit, public bus stop she knew was equipped with Wi-Fi. She paused, opened her phone, and quickly sent a pre-drafted text message to her sister, who was 3 states away. Text: "Send 11:21 p.m. just so worried about Victor. Out on my walk again. His heart just doesn't sound right. I think all the stress is finally getting to him." She waited the excruciating 30 seconds it took for the delivery confirmation, then closed the phone and turned off the location tracking. That single time-stamped message on her sister's phone, placing her emotionally and physically away from Victor while expressing concern, would be more powerful than any eyewitness. She finally reached the park at 11:55 p.m. She found the pre-selected bench, sat down, and allowed herself to breathe. She hadn't heard a siren. No panicked calls. Just the quiet hum of the city she no longer belonged to. He's gone, she thought. It's done. Her mind, which had been a perfectly calibrated engine for months, finally began to shut down. Not with regret, but with a terrifying emptiness. The revenge had been the goal, the only thing tethering her to this world. Now that it was achieved, she was floating. She sat for 20 minutes, letting the cold night air numb her skin, letting the silence cement her alibi. When she stood up, she was no longer Clara, the planner. She was Clara, the bereaved wife. She took out her phone and called the condo landline. It rang 8 times. She hung up, her lower lip trembling slightly, the first genuine sign of emotion she had allowed. Then she called Victor's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Her walk back was slower, punctuated by calculated, escalating panic. She called the landline twice more. Then she called 911. Her voice was perfect, breathy, high-pitched, laced with frantic fear. "My husband. He won't answer. He's been having heart problems, he has so much stress. I just went for a walk and now he won't pick up." The operator, trained to deal with hysteria, was calm. "Ma'am, stay where you are. We are dispatching an officer to do a wellness check." Clara, leaning against the lamppost 2 blocks from the condo, sank to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest. She wasn't acting anymore. The terror that she would somehow be caught, that her perfect, beautiful calculation would be ruined by a single sloppy mistake, was real. The siren approached, distant at first, then closer, its flashing lights painting the street in urgent red and blue. The police car pulled up beside her. A young, serious officer approached her cautiously. "Ma'am? Are you Clara?" She looked up, her eyes wide with a carefully constructed panic. Is he okay?" The officer's expression was grim. "I need you to come with me, ma'am. We found your husband." In the back of the police car, Clara did not look at the condo. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had executed a perfect final sentence. They were still not trembling. They were merely cold. The game had begun. The investigation was assigned to Detective Ethan Hayes, a man whose reputation was built on his patience for detail. Hayes was known not for finding the flashiest evidence, but for finding the anomaly, the one tiny error that didn't fit the narrative of a natural death. Hayes walked into the sterile condo, already skeptical. He knew the stats. Sudden cardiac arrests in men under 55 were common, but not this common. The scene was too neat. Victor Caldwell was slumped in an armchair, a glass of expensive scotch on the side table, and a glass of water, presumably for his antacid, beside it. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. A textbook, quiet demise. But Hayes didn't trust textbooks. He interviewed Clara Caldwell immediately. She was the picture of a woman utterly spent. Exhausted, weeping softly into a tissue, giving detailed yet vague answers. His heart. I kept telling him. The stress was too much. The business, the debt collectors, it just killed him, she repeated almost like a mantra. Hayes listened, taking slow, deliberate notes. He didn't ask about the body or the time of death. He asked about routine. What was Victor's last hour like, Clara? She recounted the night precisely. The guests, Victor's drinking, his demand for his antacid, and her exit for her stress walk. She produced the receipt and the text message without being asked, a preemptive defense so smooth it raised a red flag immediately. Grief-stricken people don't think about evidence. You said you were worried about his heart, but you left him alone after he'd been drinking heavily to go on a long walk? Hayes asked, his voice gentle, probing. It was the only thing that calmed me down, detective, she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. He was so angry when he drank. I couldn't be near him. I needed to clear my head. I thought he was just having an upset stomach, not this. The timeline was flawless. 11:05 p.m. approximate. Clara leaves. Victor consumes the poison. 11:15 p.m. Clara buys water at the convenience store, confirmed by video receipt. 11:21 p.m. Clara texts her sister, confirmed by phone records, content shows concern. 11:59 p.m. Clara calls 911. Hayes reviewed the preliminary autopsy. Cause of death, acute myocardial infarction. Natural causes. Case closed. But Hayes wasn't done. He spent the next 3 days doing what no one else would, profiling the victim. Victor Caldwell, despite his outward charm, was a monster. He had bankrupted his partner, humiliated his wife, and had a history of verbal abuse confirmed by neighbors and the departed business associates. The profile was clear. This was a man who had created a lot of motive. Hayes knew he needed to look for potassium, but he had no probable cause. He started looking for the discrepancy in Clara's flawless narrative. He went back to the condo. He ignored the big picture and looked for the mundane. He focused on the glasses on the side table. The Scotch glass had Victor's clear, sloppy fingerprints. The water glass, however, had been wiped clean, almost perfectly. Why wipe a glass of water but not a glass of Scotch? Hayes looked closer at the counter where Clara said she had placed the antacid. He noticed a faint, almost invisible white residue near the sink. He swabbed it. It tested positive for a high concentration of baking soda, a common antacid component. The revelation was chilling in its implication. If Victor had taken his antacid, the residue should have been in the water glass or near the armchair. The presence of the residue near the sink suggested a spill, or an entirely separate glass. Hayes had the probable cause he needed. He ordered a deep-dive toxicology screen, specifically targeting high levels of potassium ions in the cardiac tissue, a test that cost time and political capital. Clara was home, observing her own grief. She knew the autopsy had come back clean. She was safe. The fear was receding, replaced by a cold, quiet satisfaction. Then Detective Hayes knocked on her door 3 days later. He didn't look tired, he looked certain. He sat across from her, not in the living room but in the sterile, brightly lit kitchen. The atmosphere was different. The performance space had changed. Clara, Hayes began, leaning forward. You're a meticulous woman. I understand that. You planned everything. The alibi, the health concerns, the perfect dose. Clara's face remained placid. Detective, I don't know what you're talking about. My husband died of a heart attack. He did? Hayes agreed, nodding slowly. A heart attack triggered by a massive, sudden injection of potassium chloride. We found it, Clara. Your meticulous plan failed because you failed to anticipate one tiny human detail. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, laminated photograph. It wasn't the chemical analysis. It was a close-up of the floorboard in her closet, the one she had used to hide the vial. We found traces of a white powder here, Hayes said, pointing to a barely visible scratch in the wood grain. It matched the high-purity potassium chloride we found in Victor's tissue. You forgot to clean beneath the loose floorboard. Clara stared at the photo. Her perfect plan. The months of research, the alibi, the flawless execution, all undone by a grain of powder trapped in a microscopic scratch she hadn't seen. The composure that had been her shield for months finally, catastrophically shattered. He deserved it, she choked out, the tears finally coming, not of grief but of absolute, consuming fury. He took everything. He made me a nobody. He didn't just ruin me, he laughed at the fire he started. I had to clean up his mess, and he was the mess. She plunged into a detailed, desperate confession, outlining every step of the plot, the public library research, the P.O. box, the antacid swap. The story poured out of her, raw and volatile, a torrent of all the rage and despair she had meticulously suppressed. Hayes simply let her talk, the silence of the room swallowing her screams. When she finished, she was slumped over the kitchen counter, exhausted, yet eerily calm. The ghost was finally laid to rest. Hayes leaned back, his own expression one of quiet resignation. Clara, revenge doesn't make you whole. It only makes you a victim of the same darkness you wanted to escape. She didn't look up. No, detective. I'm not a victim. I'm finished. And that is its own kind of justice. Clara Caldwell's trial became a sensational media spectacle. The prosecution presented the evidence. The fatal potassium, the convenience store video, the text message, and the tearful, tape-recorded confession. The defense argued a form of temporary insanity driven by abuse and financial ruin. The jury, however, saw the calculation. They saw the cold 8-month preparation. They saw the meticulous alibi. They did not see a woman who snapped. They saw a woman who plotted. Clara was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down the maximum sentence. As she was led away, she caught the eye of Detective Hayes, sitting in the back row of the courtroom. She gave him a small, brief, and utterly chilling smile. Not of triumph, but of finality. She had traded her freedom for a single moment of perfect, balanced justice. The woman who had lost everything had gained one thing: control. The story of Clara Caldwell is a dark mirror, reflecting the terrifying truth that the most dangerous villains aren't the ones who act on impulse, but the ones who plan in silence. Betrayal is a fire, but when it consumes a cold heart, it doesn't burn out. It becomes a perfectly focused, destructive energy. And sometimes, the calculated revenge of a scorned lover is a plot too perfect to fail, or too perfect to ignore the tiny flaw that confirms the truth. If this story of calculation and cold-blooded justice chilled you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories that explore the darkest corners of the human mind.